Great. Hi, everyone. Again, welcome to today's session, Getting Great Feedback, Designing Surveys for Staff and Clients. We're really glad you're here. We're going to be looking at today's agenda here as we dive in. The first stop on our journey is going to be, why would we want to use surveys in the first place? What are the best ways and situations that you might want to apply a survey? Then we'll be looking at some of the methods that you can use with surveys, how to write survey questions, as well as the response categories. We want to be really careful about how we're setting up our survey questions and setting up participants for success. We're going to be looking at wording and structure, and then the overall questionnaire design. And then the final piece, once we've got our survey designed, everything is ready to go, it's been reviewed, how you can think about sending it out and collecting your survey results. Awesome, and then we have just a quick icebreaker here to get us started. We wanted to ask you all, this is a question that we asked in our team, we got some great responses. So we wanted to ask if you've ever seen or taken a really bad survey, and if so, what made it so bad? And you can feel free to turn up, open your mic and share if you'd like to that way, or you can drop an example in the chat as well.
I can share, I participated in a survey relatively recently with following up after COVID vaccines, just checking in on how progress. And I was frustrated because the questions didn't give me a chance to give all the information that I wanted to give. And so there weren't spaces for me to give the information I wanted to provide. And I just found that really frustrating.
So Megan from Denise Louise saying surveys that take too much time or too long. Absolutely. We had a coworker said that, I believe it was the CDC called her and said, we'd like to do a 10-minute survey with you. And it ended up being a 1-hour survey. When you're setting an expectation for a 10-minute survey and you end up taking an hour out of somebody's day, it's kind of a bait and switch. So unclear or leading questions. Yeah, absolutely. Want to make sure things are as clear as possible and we're not biasing responses. We have kind of a silly example here. Heather, do you want to pull up the quiz here? Kirsten says surveys that require you to free write all your answers. So yeah, all of those open-ended, it kind of puts some more burden on the participant. Surveys that are very stereotypical and with harmful questions, absolutely, absolutely. And especially when it hasn't been vetted with the community, yeah, there can be some really harmful surveys out there. A never-ending survey, yes. You definitely want to see where you're at in the survey and know when it's going to end. So this is, let's see, this is just a silly example, but this BuzzFeed quiz on which melancholy vegetable matches your personality. So first question, which part of the tray would you, is it least like to eat or most like to eat there? Least like to eat. First of all, there's carrots in 2 of the sections. There's overlap. It's not very clear. You've got ranch in all of them. If you don't like ranch, it's a problem. How far would you like your vegetables to be from ranch dressing? Is really close up. Is that close to the ranch dressing? Is that a lot of ranch dressing? Is the far away? Is that a small bit of ranch? It's hard to say what's going on here. And then if you were to parachute onto the field below, where would you try to land? What does this have to do with the vegetables? It's really, and the melancholiness of it, where does it come in? So obviously BuzzFeed didn't validate this survey. I don't think it's a psychological test. Hopefully it's not going to say anything about who we are as people, but it can be frustrating when people run into these type of questions, because if they're not clear, or they're hard to understand, you're not going to get valid results. So I'm sure there have been many more bad surveys that people have run into over the years, and feel free to share if you have more examples that come to mind as we go along. All right, so without further ado, I'll hand things over to Bethany, and she's going to help us dive into this question of why surveys.
Thanks, Jen. And just to put it out there, I took that quiz and was a melancholy onion, and I have no idea what that means. So it just was an unhelpful survey all the way around. All right, so in terms of surveys, I'm sure you've all seen different surveys, taken them, maybe even created them. So you probably have a picture in your head, but it's a research method that uses a set of predetermined questions that you're posed to a group to really understand beliefs, attitudes, characteristics, and opinions. And we often use these to collect feedback on organizations, programs, and trainings, or they can be part of a larger research project as well, where you're collecting information from the community or a state or country even. So there's lots of different uses for surveys. Next slide, please. So if you are about to start a survey, the first step is to think about what information you're going to need. And it's really important that you're always thinking in terms of the results that you need and want. So some of the ways to figure this out are to ask yourself, what question am I trying to answer? What problem am I trying to solve? What do I need the data for? And who am I collecting the data for? Because all of these are going to shape how you put your survey together. So once you've narrowed in on really what you need to be focused on in this survey, you'll need to think through who your sample is. So we often talk about this in terms of being a population of interest, which just means the group you want to know more about, or who you need to collect data from. So it's either a targeted population, like your organization's staff or clients, or it could be a subset of the general population, like I mentioned a minute ago with some of the larger research studies. I think we have a poll quickly. So if you could take a moment to think through which survey methods would your clients be most likely to respond to, and check all of these that apply.
Bethany, are you able to see the results?
Yes, I am on this one. Thank you.
Yep.
So it looks like online and face-to-face are in a tie, followed by phone and mail. So we're going to talk about the pros and cons of each of these methods. But it looks like maybe you have some experience with all of these, so that's great. All right, so once you have decided on the survey and your population, there are these different methods of surveys that you can choose from. So the first we're going to talk through are online surveys. And I'm wondering, from those of you who've used these or taken these before, what you think some of the pros and cons of using online surveys are. And feel free again to unmute yourself or use the chat. give you a second to process. Yeah, reminder emails, those take time. Definitely you get quick responses. Cost is low, not accessible to everyone. Some families won't know how to fill it out. It's very convenient, easy to send links. Yeah, these are great. So you've covered most of our list here. So you said a lot of these things that I think in addition, some of the pros are that they're customizable and you have that automatic data entry. So you're not having to enter data on the other side. And it lets people be really anonymous when they're taking the surveys, which can help. Some of you also mentioned a lot of these cons. A couple additional ones to consider are that if you don't have a list of people you're sending this out to and you're just having to post a survey link because you want community input, you can get some pretty bad data. Either people just trying to take a survey quickly to get an incentive, or some bot issues, things like that. And then also survey fatigue is another one that I'm not sure was mentioned, but I think the others were covered. Okay, so same question for those of you who use mail surveys. What are some of the pros and cons of using this type of survey method? Yeah, slower response times, cost of postage. Yes, accurate addresses too. Those can be really difficult to get. Junk mail fatigue, that's great, yeah.
You might have somebody's 4-year-old daughter filling it out in made up cursive.
Yes. Yes, you don't know who's filling it out. Pros are easy, cons less responsive. Great. Yep, they get thrown away. Awesome. Okay, so some additional pros are that there's a sense of privacy when you have a physical survey that you can take anywhere you want. And there's no interviewer who might bias how you fill out the survey. And someone mentioned this, but it might be more accessible to certain populations rather than an online or phone survey. This was definitely mentioned, expensive. You have to print those surveys, stuff them in envelopes, address the envelopes, pay for postage, and then you also need to have a postage paid return envelope so people can send it back. So it takes a lot of time to do all of that, and it's very costly. You also then, when you get the surveys back, end up needing to do the data entry, which takes a lot of time as well. And then as Jen said, you're not sure if it was the 4-year-old in the house or the person you were hoping would take the survey. Okay, next one are telephone surveys. It looked like this was the lowest on the poll, but what do you think might be some of the pros and cons for phone surveys? Yeah, definitely. Not everyone answers their phone. You do have a better chance of knowing who's responding. Yep, and you can get a survey filled out right there and then. These are great. Yeah, it can be, the survey can be translated on the spot. Perfect. So yeah, again, you've covered a lot of these, but quick results. You have the ability to deal with questions that come up right away, or if wording is problematic for someone, you can have some prompts ready to go, and you know you're talking to the person you want to. On the other hand, it can be time consuming. Somebody has to actually make all of those phone calls. And as someone said, not everyone's going to answer their phone, and not everyone has a phone. For some people, just hearing information verbally is going to be challenging. And so that can be a problem if they don't have a physical copy in front of them. And then you also need an interviewer who's conducting the telephone survey, who has to be trained and is following a pretty strict script, so they're not biasing the results in any way. All right, and our last method is face-to-face. So what do you think are some of the pros and cons of this? And hint, they're similar to the pros and cons of the other ones. Yeah, absolutely. Megan says relationship may positively or negatively influence the survey, and that's absolutely right. It can be a personal relationship, or it can even just be how someone looks, or if they're from a different cultural background, speak a different language, that can change the dynamic in the room and lead to different survey results. Yes, and the participant being comfortable responding honestly, that's absolutely an issue. We tend to, if we're talking to somebody, especially that we don't know well, we can end up kind of biasing what we say based on what we think they want to hear. And yes, Lindsay, same as the telephone survey, because you're right there in the moment with someone, it's easy to be able to explain any or answer any questions, explain anything that people aren't understanding. Yes, and it's definitely, Teresa says it's not always anonymous. Certainly that's an issue with face-to-face. So some additional pros are that if you're in person, and when I say face-to-face, I'm meaning Zoom or in person in the same room. But you can also communicate questions with visual aids, which can be really helpful for certain populations. You know that the person you're interviewing is who you want to be interviewing, and you can get very quick responses, just like the phone. On the other hand, it can be very time consuming, again, because somebody has to sit there and read the questions with the participant. And again, you need that trained interviewer so they know what they can say and what they shouldn't say, so they don't accidentally lead the participant. There's usually some travel required, either the participants coming to the interviewer or vice versa. And so you tend to have lower response rates. And then if you're not entering data into a computer or tablet as it's happening, you'd also have to do that data entry after the fact, which takes a lot of time. All right, so the next step, once you've picked your method that you think will work best for your population, is that you'll start writing your survey questions. And deciding what kind of information you want is really important, because it's easy to ask for one type of information when you're really wanting a different type altogether. So it's very important to think through exactly what kinds of information you want those respondents to provide, and then how you're going to get there. So there's generally two types of questions. The first ask for behaviors or attributes. So behaviors, what people do. So have you smoked cigarettes in the past year? Versus attributes, or who they are. So what is your profession? Is an example of that. And then there are attitudes and beliefs. Attitudes are what people say they want. So questions such as, do you favor a tax increase to support early childhood programs? Versus beliefs, what they think is true. So an example here is, does early childhood intervention lead to better educational outcomes? So you can see, oh, sorry, Heather, I paused too long. You can see that, it might be easy to accidentally, you might want to be asking about a behavior and accidentally you'd ask about an attribute, or you might want to ask about an attitude and accidentally you're asking about a belief. So just really be clear with what information you need and then how you're asking it. Now I'm ready, sorry. Okay, so some important considerations as you're starting to think about your questions is, again, what will the responses collected from a given question tell you? And is that information important to have? And then what are you going to do with it? So all of these are really to just minimize the burden on the participant. And as many of you mentioned, to keep your survey shorter. I know I tend to think everything is interesting in the world. So I'm always wanting to ask extra questions, but I really have to reel it in and say, no, this survey is about topic X and I need to stay on topic. I'm interested to know all of these other things, but this isn't the survey for that. Another thing to really consider throughout this process is what the cognitive load for your participants is. And so this is thinking through how much bandwidth is this survey taking to complete. Some of the things that increase the bandwidth for people is asking for a lot of recall information. So, what did you do last week, last month, last year? That's hard for people to remember. It's also hard and taxing on folks if you're asking them to gather information from other sources. And it can be very taxing to ask a lot of sensitive or just difficult to answer questions. So questions about abuse, criminal history, those sorts of things. Those tend to just carry a larger mental load for us. And then there are also a couple of types of error, which these are sociology terms, so I wouldn't stress too much about remembering the actual names, but just the general idea that there's something called measurement error that happens when a respondent's answer to a question is inaccurate, imprecise, or cannot be compared in a useful way to other respondents' answers. And sometimes this happens because of the survey method itself. So some research has found that questions asked by mail versus telephone versus face-to-face sometimes will produce a very different answer. So it's important that you stick to one method for all of your participants. If you're going to use phone surveys, do that for everybody. Don't do some online, some telephone, because the answers really won't be comparable. Another way that measurement error happens is through the questionnaire. So if you have response categories that aren't clearly defined, or people don't see themselves in the answer categories. That can cause error. As some of you mentioned previously, if you have an interviewer, so a face-to-face or telephone situation, that interviewer can bias the data collected by leading participants, or just sometimes, again, because of power imbalances or perceived biases on either side. And then the respondent as well can contribute to measurement error. So we need the respondents to be willing to provide honest answers. And some people, I would say this is less common, but some people deliberately don't want to share information, and others provide poor data just because they don't understand a question, and they just make a mistake on the survey. So then there's also non-response error, which happens when a significant number of the people in the survey sample do not respond to the questionnaire and are different from those who do respond in a way that is important to the study. So an example I like to think of here is if you were interested in looking at barriers to technology among seniors, and you sent an online survey to a list of seniors to ask about their barriers to tech use, the people who don't respond are probably going to be the people with the largest barriers to technology. And so you're missing this whole group of people who you actually really want their responses to your survey. So in sum, you are just trying to set participants up for success by creating clear, concise, and on-topic questions using a format they can engage with. And I think it's time for a short break. Should we do 5 minutes?
Hit record again. All right. So we're going to be looking into a little bit of the survey question structure. So there are 4 basic types of survey questions. The first one here is the open-ended question. Somebody mentioned that at the beginning of bad surveys when every question is an open-ended question, but it definitely has its place. We've got an example here. Do you have any additional feedback to provide? So this is a space when you're going to have a lot of different responses. There's no way to really code or classify these ahead of time. You're going to want to leave that open space for people to be able to respond and give their unique feedback. You definitely want to make sure that you're leaving enough room for participants to respond to the question. If you ask if people have any additional feedback and you give a tiny little spot, what you're communicating means that you're not actually interested in their feedback. So definitely be mindful about giving enough space for people to write in their own response. The next type here is the closed-ended question with ordered responses. So basically these are questions where the responses fall on a continuum. There's sometimes you can see them with numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a scale. This example here, whether or not our community needs more recycling bins, and you're asking folks to strongly disagree, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And you definitely want to make sure that these are ordered in the correct order. You don't want to go from strongly disagree to strongly agree and then a mildly disagree. You want to make sure these are ordered in the correct order. And then the next example here is a closed-ended question. So again, where you have a limited number of responses to the question. These are responses that you've provided. This next example is with unordered response choices. So basically your response choices could be in any order. There's no set order. One is not more or less than the other. So for example, the race question, what is your race? And these are in alphabetical order, almost alphabetical order, it looks like. But there's no right or wrong way of ordering these answer choices. And then the final example here of survey question type is the partial closed-ended survey question. And so basically what you're doing here is adding a other option, a write-in option. Please specify other language you can use, so that if someone doesn't feel identified with the options that you've given in the closed-ended question, that they can write in their own response. And then another best practice is to include that prefer not to answer question. And that can allow people to answer the question. And if their answer truly is prefer not to answer, they have a space that they can fill that in and not feel frustrated that or feel like they just need to skip it altogether. Great. And then one thing you want to take care of and pay attention to is the response order. So the order of responses matters, especially when you think about having a long list of response options. So in our example here, we have which ice cream flavors do you like? And we've got, I don't know, like 10 responses there. If you are filling this out on a mail or online survey, if you're filling it out visually, participants are most likely to choose one of the first 5 options. They're the first ones that hit their eyes. They might not even get to the bottom. They might read through and be like, oh yeah, I like chocolate, and just mark it off without getting through the whole list. But if people are filling out through the phone or in-person interview style surveys, they're most likely to choose one of the last options. This is because they're hearing the responses, the response options, and the last response options are the ones that are going to stick closer into their, they're going to be fresher in their memory. So you might list off these 10 options, and by the time you get to mint chip, the person who's filling this out doesn't even remember that you mentioned vanilla at the beginning. So you just want to be careful and aware of that category order effect, and be mindful of that, especially when you have those long lists of response options. The other thing we want to make sure about is that the response options are complete, they're exhaustive. So for example, this age category question, how old are you? Making sure that all of your options are covered. You don't want to have any gaps in the ages, in the age brackets. And then we also want to make sure that the responses are mutually exclusive, or that there's no overlap. So if you have a category that's age 0 to 10, and then you have another category that's age 8 to 12, someone who's age 9 would really have trouble figuring out which of the options they're supposed to fill out. So making sure the category options are both exhaustive, they're fully complete, and represent all the possibilities of people that might be filling out the survey. You can also add in that other or not listed above option, and also making sure that they're mutually exclusive so that there's no overlap in your categories. Great, and then recall information. This is something that Bethany mentioned before, but just some strategies for getting around this. So it can be difficult to recall information accurately. Our example here is, what did you eat last Friday? So that was a week ago, and I have no clue. I don't even remember what I ate yesterday. So to answer this would be a tough one for me. It would put a lot of weight on me. I would have to really think about, okay, what happened last Friday? What did I eat? And I would probably give you bad data. So if you're going to ask this question, it would probably be better to think about either asking it on the day that you're interested in having that information, or the next day. Or thinking about maybe having people do a log, that sort of thing. And then the other thing that can be helpful, if you do have to ask about information in the past and you're asking people to remember, is to have participants think about a significant or memorable event that has to do with a question. So this could be before or after your child was born, before or after you enrolled in the program. The example here is, how many times have you moved since you finished high school? So we've given kind of a deadline there. Not everyone has finished high school, so that might be something to think about too, depending on who you're surveying. But just thinking about a significant event that can help people recall and think about things without having to put too much burden on the participant. And again, it's important, it's going to be, your data is going to be more accurate if it's collected in real time, in the moment that an event is happening. So if you can, not everyone has the opportunity, but if you can think about applying a before, mid, or an after survey, you're going to get more accurate data from each time period. That way you're not asking people to remember, especially their beliefs and attitudes are really hard to think about in the past. So, great. All right, so just some do's and don'ts here when we're thinking about wording and structure. You want to make sure you're being specific, using simple words, keeping it as short as possible. And then another thing to think about is making sure that the data that you're collecting, if you're revising an old survey, that your new data is going to be able to be compared with your older data. So for example, let's say we had our first survey was, what is your attitude toward climate change? And we're thinking about revising that survey and changing it to, what is your belief about climate change? So we're getting at two different things, pretty nuanced, but we might be getting some different responses there, and we might not be able to compare those results. And it's okay to make changes in your survey, but just be aware that you may not be able to compare to older survey results. And then we want to make sure that you're using complete sentences, including that prefer not to answer or the other please specify answer categories whenever that's applicable. That write-in option can be really helpful so that participants feel that they can write in their own option and be represented if you haven't included the option that best represents them in the survey. And also make sure that your survey results, or sorry, your responses are exhaustive and that participants are heard and seen accurately. It can help with avoiding frustration and bad data, especially if that option isn't available. You do want to think about how you're going to handle write-in options in the analysis, because you're going to get really different responses. So just something to be aware of when you're setting up the survey. And then another best practice here is using questions that are vetted in other surveys. So looking around to other organizations that are doing similar work or associations that may have a survey similar to what you're interested in collecting. And then being mindful of wording on objectionable or potentially sensitive questions so that you're not biasing or putting the participant in an uncomfortable place, being really careful. So our example here is, do you like to bully people? Yes, no, maybe. So you're probably not going to get great data from this. No one's probably going to confess that they like to bully people. There are probably other ways to get at this question if there's bullying behavior that's happening in a school environment. But asking if people like to bully other people is probably not the best way to get at it. All right, and make sure that, so the don'ts, we went through the do's. These are the don'ts. Make sure you're not being vague. You want to be as precise as possible in your question. But at the same time, you don't want to ask for too much precision from the respondent. So if you're asking, again, what you ate for breakfast last Friday, or to do a lot of detail in the response that can be a lot of weight on the participant, the person who's filling out the survey. And then also being careful about using leading phrases or biased language or tone. So our example here is, our survey question is, the Capacity Collective is the absolute best, agree or disagree? So we've already, in our question, we've already stated that we think that the Capacity Collective is the absolute best, and we've just asked you to agree or disagree. Probably not going to get very honest feedback. Also, there's not a lot of nuance in those survey response choices, so not going to give us great data. You also want to be careful about using jargon or undefined abbreviations, and these are all over the place in the nonprofit world and the government sector. So being careful about defining the terms that you're using. So this example here, have you ever received services from any of the following? So if the person who's filling out the survey doesn't know what all these acronyms stand for, they may have received services, but they may not be able to accurately fill out the survey and actually give you the data that you need. All right, and then again, that goes along with assuming that respondents know about certain topics, especially when you're surveying the broader community. Community members may not have knowledge about the specific program that you're working with or the specific work that you're doing. Again, being careful about asking for complex calculations. What % of your income do you spend on rent each month? So I've asked someone to not only tell me how much they spend on rent and how much they earn, but also to calculate that out into a percentage. And that's something that I can do on the back end if I ask both of those questions separately. If I ask income and then I ask rent, I can divide those out to get the percentage. So taking some burden off the participant, and I'm going to get better data that way. And then finally, thinking about, let's go back just one there, asking multiple questions at once. So double barrels. I think this came up at the beginning too. If you're asking 2 questions at once, it's hard for people to know which question you want answered, or when you evaluate the responses to really know which one they were answering at the time. So being careful about that, making sure each question is just one single question at a time. All right, next slide. All right, so we have some examples here that we wanted to workshop together. We've put together a question here that's got some problems, and it can be more than one problem with each question. And so we're going to do some troubleshooting. The issues can be in the question, and they can also be within the response categories. Heather's going to put a poll up here on the screen, and we'd love it if you could identify what you think some of the problems are with this question. So this example here is, do you actively support, or not support home visiting programs in your community? And our answers are actively support, and not support. So let us know if you think this is an unclear question, if it's got too much precision, if it's got extensive recall, sensitive information, or complex calculations. Okay, and is everybody seeing the results there? Looks like the top one is unclear question. Yeah, it's hard to say, what is this actively support, not support? What does that even mean? What does it mean to actively support a home visiting program? And let's see, Heather, if you click through, I think we should get some of those, yeah, some of the problems here. There's a high cognitive load with this question. And it's not going to give us useful data because we really haven't defined our terms. what does it mean to support the home visiting program? And also, we're assuming that respondents know about the home visiting program in the community. So we're being pretty vague in the way we've asked the question, not very clear at all. So here's an option, a possibility of how we could fix or workshop this question, is adding in some context and definition to the question. So King County has, and we would explain the program, home visiting program with these characteristics. Would you be willing or not willing to, and then specific action. So thinking about how we operationalize support. So it could be thinking about voting for a tax increase, or it could be thinking about volunteering with the program. It could be supporting this locally by connecting resources. So there could be a lot of different ways to put that support into practice. And then we're asking the person to respond if they're willing, not willing, or undecided. We've given that third option in case anyone is not sure where they're at. Great. All right. Next example here. The original question is, what is your annual household income? So let us know what you think, and whether it's an unclear question, there's jargon or undefined abbreviations, assuming previous knowledge, answers are incomplete, or biased language. And you can answer more than one of these responses. And I'm realizing as we're doing this that this is my bad for not vetting my question. I left off one answer that was important. So if you want to drop it in the chat, if you have any other options that you'd like to drop in the chat, feel free to do that. Awesome. Yeah, Tracy, sensitive info, absolutely. So asking annual household income is sensitive information. And many people aren't willing to answer personal questions like those about income. So one way we can get around this is giving those income brackets. So we've got some options here, allowing folks to put themselves in an income bracket. People might feel more comfortable doing that than giving us a specific number. Also, assuming that people know their annual household income, there might be other ways that we could get at answering this question or asking this question, because not everyone has a consistent annual household income. So something we might want to think about as well. Great. All right. Next example here is, how many times did you read? Oh, sorry, I skipped to the next one here. Do you favor publicly funded home visiting programs and doula services? So the question here is whether or not this is an unclear question, biased language, if there's jargon, assumes previous knowledge, and multiple questions at once. All right, so I'm seeing a lot of multiple questions at once. Absolutely, we're asking both about home visiting programs and doula services, which are two separate issues, two separate questions. What if you favor doula services, but you don't favor home visiting programs. What do you do? Well, how do you answer? I think the jargon or the undefined terms is also, not everyone might know what a doula service is or a home visiting program. It assumes that previous knowledge. So we want to make sure we're really clear about what those are. All right, so possible solution is breaking this into 2 questions. We could say, do you favor home visiting programs? And we'd want to add in some sort of description there so that we're really defining our terms. And do you favor doula services? It's going to be a separate question. Great. All right, so now we're at how many times did you read a story to your child last year? What sort of problems are you seeing with this question? So too much precision, extensive recall, assumes previous knowledge, complex calculation, and or answers are incomplete. And feel free to vote more than once. It should be a multiple select question. You should be able to hit more than one. All right. So I'm seeing a lot here on extensive recall. Yes, 1 year is a long time to remember, especially if you're a parent. So it can be a lot to think about how many times you read a story to your child last year. Extensive recall, too much precision. Yeah, thinking about counting the number of times you've read a story in 1 whole year. That's a lot to think about. It's a complex calculation, absolutely. Maybe folks are thinking about, well, maybe like once a week, so that's what, 52 weeks in a year. So, you know, there's a lot to think about there. And it can slow people down and be frustrating to get that sort of question. So one way we could workshop this is to offer answers with more manageable time periods, or to ask for recall of a more recent period. So last month, maybe, and we could think about, so if we're going to go for that year question, or maybe it could be the last 2 months, we could give those options of never, once a month, twice a month, once a week, more than once a week. And we'd want to make sure that you're specifying the time period. So if it's last month or last week, the last 6 months, making sure you're being really clear about how you're phrasing your question. Great. All right, so our next example here is how much do you spend on transportation? $10 to $20 a week, 20 to 30 a week, or more than 50 a week? So the options here are, this is an unclear question, it requires extensive recall, answers overlap, it's a complex calculation, and or answers are incomplete. It's fun being able to see the results come in on this end. I wish people could see what the voting looks like. Great, awesome. So we've got answers that overlap. The 10 to 20 overlaps with the 20 to 30 option, and they're not exhaustive or complete. So what if you spend $40 a week on transportation? There's no option for that. Also, if you spend $5 a week on transportation, that's not covered either. So there's both incomplete answers and overlap, which is kind of a worst case scenario. And then the question isn't specific about the time period. So you might think from the answer, the responses that we could be thinking about, is it an average week? Is it last week? Are you asking me to think about a year ago? What's the time period that the question is trying to get at? So again, yeah, asking for some extensive recall as well. All right, so one of the options that we could kind of workshop this and fix it a little bit is asking people on average, how much do you spend on transportation per week? So just to think about an average week, you might want to get even a little more specific depending on the purpose of the question. But we want to make sure we're offering really complete response options here. So we don't have any overlap, and also all the options are covered. All right, got a few more examples here. This one here, I feel comfortable talking to my home visitor. Disagree, agree, or strongly agree. So is it an unclear question? There's biased language, assumes previous knowledge, sensitive information, and or answers are incomplete. All right, awesome. So strongest response here, biased language. Yeah, we have 2 responses that are on the agree side, and we have only 1 response that's on the disagree side. We also don't have any neutral responses. We're really not giving a lot of nuance in the options that we're allowing people to respond. And then also I'm seeing sensitive information. Think about if this is given through a face-to-face survey or a telephone survey, and the person that's giving the survey is your home visitor, and you're being asked to tell the person in the survey if you feel comfortable or not talking to that person. That might skew your data a little bit. So one way we can workshop this is setting this up as a statement. I feel comfortable talking to my home visitor, but then giving complete options. So strongly disagree to strongly agree. And we've also got that neutral option in the middle, neither agree nor disagree. And again, this can vary culturally. There's not one right way to set this up, but we just want to make sure that we're giving options so that all of that range of responses can be reflected. So that might be 5 responses, it might be 3, making sure that you're allowing folks to reflect their opinion. Great. One final response or example here. So our question is, more people exercise regularly now than they did 10 years ago. Do you exercise regularly or do you not exercise regularly? So is this an unclear question? Does it require extensive recall? Use biased language? Ask multiple questions at once, or give incomplete answers? Awesome. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of unclear question and multiple questions at once. Yeah, and we're also getting this influence or bias by kind of setting up the question with this statement that more people exercise regularly now than they did 10 years ago. It's kind of not really relevant or kind of biasing by saying that everyone exercises regularly. And then how do we define exercise? How do we define regularly? Is this light exercise? Is this strenuous exercise? That extensive recall piece by throwing in that 10-year reference point, it's kind of confusing. Are we asking the person to compare their exercise now to 10 years ago? It's hard to know what's going on. And then the final piece, do you exercise regularly or do you not exercise regularly? Are you supposed to say yes, no? Which one are you answering? There's just a lot going on here. So one way we could fix this is asking, how often do you usually exercise, and giving some examples such as bike, walk, or swim. Never, once a week, 2 to 4 times a week, 4 to 6 times a week, or daily. So giving all the options and being a little more specific in what we mean by exercise. And we could even tighten this up by saying in the last 6 months or in the last month, and really drilling down on the time period depending on what we're interested in the survey. Great. Well, thanks for all of the feedback and some great workshopping there. I'll hand things over back again to Bethany.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. That was good to go through. There's so many things on every question that even as you all were bringing it up, I was like, oh yeah, we didn't note that, but it's easy to have problematic questions. So it's a good reminder to just go through them. So once you have all of the questions, you'll want to start thinking about how you'll actually design your questionnaire. And one of the best places to start is just kind of writing up an intro paragraph to your survey so people know what the survey is for. If you need consent, you can talk about that. You should discuss confidentiality, and you can let the respondent know how long this survey is going to take them to complete. So we have just an example here from a recent survey we did that was about a movement arts center that it was being designed for Seattle. And so it's explaining what a movement arts center is, asking for honest feedback to help understand what people in Seattle want in a movement arts center. We define what a movement arts center is. Give them an option here to take a 1-minute or 5-minute survey, and then let them know that it's going to be kept confidential and that we aren't going to be sharing any of their identifying information. I think we just have some highlights here. But that really sets the context for the whole survey and helps people understand why they're taking time to provide their feedback. So when you're thinking about the order of your questions, you want to think about ordering them on a scale from the most interesting and topic related at the beginning to those most likely to be objectionable at the end. So in the beginning, you want to start with something easy that directly relates to the topic, but that is not embarrassing or too personal. And you shouldn't probably ask an open-ended question to begin with, because you really want to set the stage that give the respondent confidence that they're going to be able to complete the survey. And another thing that I usually try to think of when I'm thinking through my first couple of questions is, what do I really want to know that if somebody stops this survey after the first question, that I still have a little bit of meaningful data? So for instance, on that Seattle Movement Arts project that we just showed a blurb of, the first question on there was, what, like on a scale of 0 to 10, how interested would you be in attending a new movement arts center? So if somebody stopped the survey after just one question, I still had a really meaningful piece of data that I could include in my findings from that person. So then after those initial questions, you can kind of be building up to any more challenging or sensitive questions. And then at the end, we typically try to end with the demographic questions. And then of course, an open-ended comment or feedback box for people to provide input on anything that they weren't able to share above. So in addition to keeping those things in mind, it's really good to think about making the survey flow like a conversation. And so part of that is you want to organize questions on the same subject together. And it's helpful to provide some descriptive transitions when you move from one topic to the next. And those can be really simple one-sentence transitions, such as, now I'd like to ask you about your relationship with your doula. And then ask those questions, and then below that, maybe you're transitioning to, now I'd like to ask you about your experience in the program, and so on. Just something so that if you're switching gears a little bit, it's helping people follow along and making the question, giving context to the question so they don't seem like they're coming out of the blue. And then you can also use the question order to really set the tone and lead up to more sensitive questions. So for instance, if you needed to know if someone had been convicted of a felony, you might want to start by asking questions about their opinions of the justice system. And then you could ask if they'd ever had a run-in with the law. And then if they say yes, you could from there could ask, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And it just kind of gives the participant, again, more context about why you're asking this, how it relates to your survey, and that it's not just prying for information that they might not want to be sharing. So there we have some format and design tips here. And of course, these are different based on the type of survey you're using, but because so much of what we do is online, we're focused on that for this part. So for the online surveys, it's really important to make these easy to read and mobile friendly. There are a lot of design templates in the online softwares, but some of them are just a little too busy and they might look really cool to you, but think about somebody who maybe doesn't read the language that you're putting this in a first language, or maybe they have a visual impairment. Just make it as clear as possible. You can also use bold, italics, and font size to indicate different parts of the survey. So the questions can be slightly bigger than the response categories, and the transitions might be bold, and so on. And you should always provide explicit instructions wherever needed, and that includes defining some of those terms. So as we saw in some of the examples, you might not always in the question want to say a doula is and define doula, but above the question you could define those terms so it's clear what you mean then when you ask the questions. Another tip is to use the required responses sparingly. Sometimes we do need to require a certain response for one reason or another, but this is something that makes people not want to complete the survey if they don't have the ability to answer or not answer questions at will. One of the best parts of online surveys is using that skip function, because that really reduces the cognitive load and the burden on participants if you can help skip over questions that aren't going to apply to them. So I highly recommend that. And then, as we've mentioned previously, just trying to limit the open-ended questions. You should include some space for feedback, but typically people skip over this box anyway. And then also the data you get is difficult to compare across participants. So it's somewhat limited in its function. We've also brought this up, but try to avoid long lists and response categories. Those are just more taxing for people to get through and end up biasing the results. Using a completion queue or progress bar is also really helpful. It lets people know they're making their way, they're almost done, and it helps people hang in there and finish the survey. And then if you are going to be doing translation, it's really important that you do that front translation, the back translation, and then also get community input for cultural translation. So making sure that the front translation was not just word for word, but that it's meaningful. It's been transcribed in a meaningful way. And then trying to test that with some community members to make sure that everything's making sense in the transcribed language. All right, so once you have your survey all set up, you should definitely pre-test it. You can have others review the questionnaire, colleagues, stakeholders, and so on. If it's possible, we recommend using a think aloud process. And that's where you have a participant actually sit with you or on Zoom and read each question and tell you how they would answer each question and why, because that helps you understand if you're getting the information that you're wanting to get, if the questions are understandable, if people are interpreting questions and responses in the same way, if you're capturing everybody in those response categories, and if you're missing any important questions that you should add. So when you're ready to send out your survey, again, it's going to depend on the type of survey, but focusing on the online surveys, you will need, if you know who you're sending the survey out to, you'll need to have a list of email addresses or a listserv ready to go. And then if you're collecting responses from the general public or specific community, you'll probably need to post the survey link on a website or social media, put in the newspaper, use flyers, and so on. You have to get a little creative when you don't have that pre-made list. So when possible, and this really only applies if you do have that list of people you're going to send the survey out to, you'll want to keep track of your response rate, which is the proportion of people in your sample who participated in the survey. So if you know, for example, that you sent the survey out to 100 people and 70 responded, your response rate would be 70%. And this is an ambitious example because for most surveys, if you're getting above 35% response rate, you're doing really well. So typically, if I know I need, say, 150 people, or no, I'm sorry, I'll back that up. If I need 50 people to respond to a survey at minimum, I know right from the start, I'll need to send it out to at least 150 people to try to get a third of them to respond. If, however, you're sending something out within your organization and you have a lot of director support or encouragement from on high to fill out this survey, then you would expect higher response rates, which is great. So some ways to increase your response rates are to offer incentives. And these can come in a variety of formats. So if you have the budget, you can offer an incentive to everybody, which is great. If your budget's a little smaller, you can do drawings for like a $25 or $50 gift card for everybody. And everybody who completes the survey will be entered in the drawing and have a chance to win. Even something like $1 being sent has been shown to increase response rates because people feel like they've gotten something out of this process and so they want to give back. So it doesn't have to be a high incentive, but just if you can offer something, that's helpful. And then if somebody needs or requests a physical copy of the survey, you do want to send it with a postage paid and self-addressed return envelope so it's easy for them to get back to you. Someone mentioned this early on, but you also want to follow up with reminder emails or calls to help people, encourage people to complete the survey. And then you can also try to promote any extrinsic motivators. So for some people, knowing that participating in your project is going to help their community or school or neighborhood will be really motivating. I've had other people who, when I've done projects with families, that they're interested in working with me because they want to introduce their child to the research process and kind of using it as a learning experience for their child. So just thinking about what are some of the other things you can let people know how their participation is going to be meaningful. All right, and then always be thinking about ethics as you're designing and conducting surveys. So first and foremost, respect that some people just aren't going to want to participate, and that's okay. Secondly, you really need to keep confidentiality. That can be using numbers or pseudonyms to replace names when applicable. It also means never presenting individual data in a way that could identify a person, but rather portraying it aggregated or as a group. So no one person could be singled out by information you're using. And it's also important to make sure that participants know if the survey is anonymous, meaning it doesn't collect any identifying information, versus if it's confidential. So it collects identifying information, but that won't be presented in a manner that identifies the individual. So some general tips for success are to have a plan, but always be prepared for things to go wrong. Flexibility is always key with this. Research and surveys never follow a straight line. It's also just really important to test your survey with anyone willing to look it over. It's great to fix glitches and bugs online in advance. You can fix typos, make little edits, and make sure it's as perfect as possible before you send it out. And then if it's possible, it's also good to let your sample group know that your survey is coming out beforehand. If you have that list of emails or a listserv, just so they know what it's for and they're expecting it and they know the deadline and all of that.
And we have an Empower tool to share a link for.
Yes, I'll drop that in the chat here.
Thanks.
And so this Empower tool goes over some of the tips and tricks and examples we've been going through and highlights some of what we've been going over today.
I think, yeah, with this, are there any questions or thoughts about all this? I know this was a lot of information.
Or perhaps any surprises, anything that you had never thought of before, but now, I don't know, something new that you're aware of.
Also, while things are coming to mind, just want to let you know that I dropped the evaluation link in the chat as well. The first link is going to be that Empower tool to survey design, and the second one is going to take you to the evaluation. We'd love it to get your feedback.
All right, well, we would love to hear more from you as you draft surveys and hear just how it goes. So as Jen said, if you could take a moment to fill out that evaluation, and of course, if you have questions down the road, please feel free to contact us. I think our contact information is on the last slide. And thank you everyone for coming today and participating.